Jesus was presented on the 10th day, which is Sunday, the triumphal entry. The 11th day, the 12th day, and the 13th day is the observation period. He was tried before Pontius Pilate. Remember, 3 times Pontius Pilate said what? I find no fault in him. I find no fault in him. That was the trial to say, this is the lamb for the sacrifice. Then, at even, on the 14th day, which would basically be Wednesday night at 6 o'clock, would be the 14th day, because you've got Sunday's the 10th, Monday's the 11th, Tuesday's the 12th, Wednesday's the 13th at 6 p.m., boom, you're into the 14th, according to God. And that's exactly when they were supposed to kill the Passover, and that's exactly when Jesus died on the cross, was a Wednesday night at 6 p.m. Look at Matthew 27, verse number 26. The Bible says here, then released he Barabbas unto them. And when he had scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. Now let me tell you what it means to be scourged. Scourging was a process where basically they would take the hands of the perpetrator, of the criminal that they were doing this to. They would take their hands and tie them up like this above their head. And then they would take a whip. And they would take that whip, and a big, strong man, I mean, this was his whole job, was to beat people with a whip all day. So this guy was big. And he would take that whip, and as Jesus' hands were held up like this, he took that whip and slammed it into his body. And that whip wrapped around his body, and he'd pull off the whip. And you know what was left behind when he pulled the whip off? The Bible says that there was a bloody stripe all the way around his body where that whip had just removed the skin. And then he'd take that whip a second time, wham, and rip it off him again, and he'd have a second stripe. And that was done to Jesus Christ 39 times he was beaten with this whip. 39 times. It's so easy sometimes to read over the Bible and not really put together what you're actually reading. I mean, you read it and say, okay, they scourged him. And you're done reading it in a half a second. Just 5 little words, and they scourged him there. But you have to understand what this was. I mean, this is brutal torture that they're doing to him. Look at the next verse. It says, he delivered him, he scourged him, he delivered him to be crucified. Then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the common hall. So on the way to him being crucified, they took him aside and gathered unto him the whole band of soldiers. And they stripped him, they ripped his clothes off him, and put on him a scarlet robe. So they stripped him down, and they put on this fancy king's scarlet robe, like a reddish purple type of a robe. And when they had platted a crown of thorns, they put it upon his head and a reed in his right hand. So they're going to make fun of him. So they strip all his clothes off him. They put this scarlet fancy robe on him. They put a reed in his hand. That's a big stick. They put a big stick in his hand. And then it says that they platted. Platted means braided. They braided together thorn bushes. But imagine, they took this crown of thorns. They took thorns and they braided them together and formed a crown. And the Bible says they put this crown and shoved it onto his head. Boy, can you imagine the pain? That your head bleeds unlike any other part of your body. The 2 parts of your body that probably bleed the most are your hands and your head. And they took this crown of thorns and they shoved it down into his head. Blood's running down his face. He's got this jacket. Think about how this. You gotta picture this. They beat him 39 times. Then they strip his clothes off him. Now imagine what it feels like when you, let's say, have you ever cut yourself and your clothes become part of the scab? You know, it kind of dries on, and then you kind of rip that off. So I think when they ripped off these clothes, it probably reopened every wound on his body. And then they put another robe on him that's going to be sticking to those stripes. And then they shove this crown of thorns onto his head. They put this stick into his hand, and then read on in verse number 29, it says, and they put it on his head, a reed in his right hand, and they bowed the knee before him and mocked him, saying, Hail, King of the Jews! And they spit upon him, and took the reed and smote him on the head. So they get down on their knees and start saying, Oh, hail Jesus! Ha ha ha, you idiot! And then they took the stick and just hit him in the head with it. Cracked him in the head with that thing. And then they spit in the face of the Son of God. Can you imagine that? Applied. Let me ask you, has the blood been applied to your heart this morning? Have you had a time when you believed on Jesus Christ and said, I am a sinner, I deserve to go to hell, I've lied, I've done wrong, but I believe that Jesus Christ is the only way to heaven. He died on the cross for me. He paid for my sins, rose again from the dead, and I'm trusting Him to take me to heaven. That's salvation.